£13,400,000. That is the exact figure the British taxpayers spent on a single missing child investigation. One operation, one case, 19 years. In September 2025, the man British and German police had publicly named as their primary suspect walked out of a German prison. He was never charged. He was found living in a tent in German woodland. This is not a story about what happened to Madeleine McCann on the night of May 3, 2007. Every media outlet in the world has told you that story. Most of them got it wrong. This is a story about every institution that was given the tools, the mandate, and the money to deliver justice, and what they chose to do with it instead. Praia da Luz, a small resort town on Portugal's southern coast. Population, approximately 4,000 people. In May 2007, it was warm, quiet, and popular with British tourists. On the evening of May 3, 2007, Kate and Jerry McCann, both British doctors, were dining at a tapas restaurant called the Tapas Bar. It sat approximately 50 meters from their holiday apartment at the Ocean Club Resort. Their 3 children were asleep in the apartment. Madeleine, their eldest, was 3 years and 11 months old. The McCanns and a group of 7 friends, later referred to in the investigation as the Tapas 7, had established a routine during their holiday. Adults would eat together in the evenings and take turns checking on their children. At approximately 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann checked on the children. He reported everything was normal. At 9:15 p.m., fellow holidaymaker Matthew Oldfield checked, but he heard no sound from the bedroom but did not enter. At 10 p.m., Kate McCann returned to the apartment. Madeleine was gone. The window in the children's bedroom was open. The shutter, which had been closed earlier in the day, had been raised from the outside. Kate McCann raised the alarm immediately. The Portuguese emergency services were called. The Polícia Judiciária, Portugal's equivalent of the Criminal Investigation Department, were notified and deployed. What happened over the next 72 hours would determine, in ways that investigators would only acknowledge years later, whether Madeleine McCann would ever be found. Critical detail. In the first 24 hours, no coordinated search of the surrounding area was launched. There was no immediate roadblock, no immediate CCTV sweep of the town, no forensic lockdown of the apartment. The apartment, a live crime scene, was accessed by multiple individuals before forensic teams arrived. A sniffer dog, brought in to search the surrounding area, was not deployed until several days after the disappearance. These are not editorial judgments. These are documented failures contained in the official Portuguese judicial records. Files that run to over 11,000 pages. The early failures mattered. In child abduction cases, the first 24 to 48 hours are operationally decisive. Evidence deteriorates. Witnesses scatter. Trails go cold. By the time the investigation began to operate at anything approaching full capacity, The window had already narrowed significantly. But the evidence failures were not the only problem. Not even close. The lead investigator assigned to the Madeleine McCann case was Detective Chief Inspector Gonzalo Amaral, a senior officer with the Polizia Judiciaria, decorated, experienced, and from the beginning, operating under a theory that would define and ultimately derail the Portuguese investigation. By June 2007, less than 6 weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, internal documents from the Polizia Judiciaria began to reflect a working hypothesis that Madeleine McCann had died inside the apartment. Accidentally, her parents, both were doctors, had concealed her body. There was no body. There was no confirmed cause of death. There was no forensic evidence of a death having occurred inside that apartment that had been tested and verified. What there was, and this is important, was a theory, and that theory became, for a significant period, the operational framework of the Portuguese investigation. On September the 7th, 2007, 4 months after Madeleine's disappearance, Kate and Jerry McCann were formally declared arguidos, official suspects under Portuguese law. The effect on the investigation was immediate and catastrophic. Resources that should have been directed outward, pursuing other leads, developing the suspect list, chasing cross-border intelligence, were now directed inward at the McCanns. Media access to information from the investigation increased. Public pressure on the McCanns intensified. The couple returned to the United Kingdom, where they were not subject to Portuguese jurisdiction. The arguido status was lifted on July 21st, 2008. Yet the Portuguese Attorney General's office concluded that there was insufficient evidence to charge either parent. The official statement read, in part, "It was not possible to obtain any evidence that would allow for the conclusion that the child has died." 11 months. The primary investigative theory of a major European police force had been built on a conclusion that the Attorney General's own office ultimately said there was no evidence to support. Gonzalo Amaral was removed from the investigation in October 2007, officially due to comments he made to the media about a separate case. Shortly after his removal, he published a book. The book set out his theory. The McCanns were responsible. Madeleine had died in the apartment. The book became a bestseller in Portugal. The McCanns sued for defamation. The legal battle ran for over a decade. The European Court of Human Rights ultimately ruled in 2024 that Portugal had violated Amaral's right to freedom of expression, a ruling that generated significant media coverage. What generated considerably less coverage was this. The ruling was about whether the book could be published. It was not a finding that the book's conclusions were correct. That distinction matters. Here is what the Portuguese investigation produced after 9 years. No named suspect, no charges, no arrest warrant, a case file of 11,000 pages. Archived. In 2008, the case was formally shelved by Portuguese authorities. It was only reopened in 2013. not because of new evidence generated by the Polizia Judiciaria, but because of a request from a British television program. See, and that brings us to Operation Grange. Operation Grange did not begin because police identified new evidence. It began because a prime minister made a phone call. In June 2011, David Cameron personally contacted Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Paul Stephenson and requested a formal review of the Portuguese investigation. 4 years after Madeleine's disappearance, no new evidence. A political decision made in response to sustained pressure from the McCann family and their legal team, and from significant media lobbying. This distinction matters more than it appears. Operation Grange began as a review, not an investigation. A team of officers tasked with reading the Portuguese case files and assessing whether a live British investigation was warranted. That review phase ran for 2 years, and it produced almost nothing that entered the public record. In October 2013, the Metropolitan Police appeared on BBC Crime Watch. A primetime reconstruction of the events of May 3, 2007 was broadcast to an audience of millions. The appeal generated over 38 new witness statements. It also generated something more significant. It gave the Home Office, which had been growing increasingly reluctant to fund an operation with no visible progress, a political justification to keep it running. 1 week after the Crime Watch broadcast, Operation Grange was formally upgraded from a review to a live criminal investigation. Let's examine what that decision actually meant in funding terms. The original budget allocation for Operation Grange's review phase was £3.5 million. It had already exceeded that figure by 2013. The upgrade to a live investigation required a new Home Office funding authorization. That authorization was granted, then granted again, then again. Parliamentary records show that Operation Grange received Home Office funding extensions in 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2020. On at least 3 of those occasions, 2015, 2017, and 2019, the operation was at risk of being wound down entirely. Officers had been reduced to single figures. The case was, operationally, on life support. On each occasion, the decision was made, politically, not operationally, to continue. Throughout this period, parliamentary questions about Operation Grange's specific activities and expenditure were routinely deflected with a single phrase: operational sensitivity. EMPs who asked what, specifically, the operation had investigated, which leads had been pursued, what the intelligence picture looked like, were told that disclosure would compromise the investigation. Over 13 years, that answer was given repeatedly, across multiple governments, across multiple Home Secretaries. The investigation that was supposed to demonstrate institutional accountability operated institutionally without accountability. By 2019, Operation Grange had been running for 8 years. Its officer count had been reduced to 4 detectives, 4 officers on what was publicly described as the most important live missing child investigation in British history. The total spend by that point, in excess of £11 million. The publicly disclosed investigative outputs, periodic statements confirming the investigation remained active. No arrests, no charges, and no extradition requests to any foreign jurisdiction. Then, in 2020, something changed. What changed was not new evidence discovered by Operation Grange. What changed was that German federal investigators, the Bundeskriminalamt, independently developed intelligence on Christian Brückner through a separate narcotics investigation. In the course of that investigation, they identified mobile phone and vehicle data placing Brückner near Praia da Luz on the night of May 3, 2007. They contacted the Metropolitan Police. Here is a question that has never been answered publicly. The Metropolitan Police had been investigating this case for 9 years, at the point when German federal police made contact with new intelligence about a viable suspect. The question that no parliamentary committee, no Home Office minister, and no police spokesperson has satisfactorily addressed is this: in 9 years of investigation and £11 million of expenditure, was Christian Brückner on Operation Grange's radar? His 2005 rape conviction in Praia da Luz? The same town, 2 years before Madeleine's disappearance, is a matter of public criminal record. His presence in the area during the relevant period was traceable through the same phone and vehicle records that German investigators later identified. The Metropolitan Police has never confirmed whether they identified Brückner independently, whether they received intelligence about him from Portuguese authorities, or whether the 2020 German contact was the first time his name entered the British investigation. That disclosure, 9 years after Operation Grange was launched, and 9 years before Brückner was publicly named, has been classified under, you already know the phrase, operational sensitivity. On June 3, 2020, German federal prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters stood before the media and named Christian Brückner as his prime suspect. Publicly, unequivocally. Operation Grange issued a supporting statement. 13 years, £13.4 million, and British law enforcement's contribution to the moment of public identification of the primary suspect was a press statement. What the Metropolitan Police shared with German prosecutors, the intelligence that formed the British input to that announcement, has never been publicly disclosed. Christian Brückner's criminal history is extensive and a matter of public record. Now, he has convictions for sexual offenses against children, for drug trafficking, for theft and property crime. Most significantly, and this detail has been consistently underreported in British media coverage, in 2005, 2 years before Madeleine McCann's disappearance, Christian Brückner raped a 72-year-old American woman in her holiday villa in Praia da Luz, the same town, 2 years earlier. He was convicted of that offense. He served a sentence in Germany. German investigators established through phone records that Brückner's mobile phone connected to a cell tower near Praia da Luz on the evening of May 3, 2007. That cell tower covered the area of the Ocean Club Resort. They also established that he drove a distinctive vehicle, a Jaguar, through the town that evening. Multiple witnesses placed the vehicle in the area. So in 2020, German prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters stated publicly, unequivocally, that he was certain Brückner was responsible for Madeleine's disappearance and death. And then something extraordinary happened. Nothing. No charges were filed against Brückner in connection with Madeleine McCann. Wolters' explanation, repeated in multiple press conferences over 5 years, was consistent. They had evidence sufficient to name him. They did not yet have evidence sufficient to charge him. That gap between naming and charging is not unusual in complex criminal investigations. Evidence standards for public identification and evidence standards for criminal prosecution are genuinely different thresholds. But here is what makes the Brückner situation different, and what makes it, from an institutional accountability standpoint, genuinely troubling. Between 2023 and 2024, Brückner was tried in a German court for 5 separate sexual offenses. Offenses entirely unrelated to Madeleine McCann. 2 rapes, 3 counts of sexual abuse of a minor. He was acquitted on all counts. The judge found the prosecution had failed to meet the evidential threshold. The witnesses were unreliable. The case was not proven. Hans Christian Wolters, the same prosecutor who had publicly named Brückner as a certain suspect in Madeleine's case, had led that prosecution. He lost. In September 2025, Brückner's sentence for the 2005 Praia da Luz rape expired. He was released. He was not rearrested. There were no outstanding charges in any jurisdiction. Operation Grange, the £13.4 million Metropolitan Police investigation, had not generated an extradition request. German prosecutors had no new charges to file. He was found living in a tent in German woodland. The man who 3 countries publicly called their prime suspect in the most high-profile missing child case in European history was free, living in a tent. As of February 2026, German prosecutors have filed a renewed application for proceedings related to the 2024 acquittals. The legal process continues. Madeleine McCann has been missing for 19 years. Let's be precise about what we're looking at. 3 sovereign nations, 3 national-level law enforcement agencies, a combined investigative timeline of 19 years, a combined expenditure that runs well beyond the publicly disclosed British figure alone. And the outcome: no conviction, no arrest, no charge, 1 named suspect, living in a tent. The Portuguese investigation closed in 2008, having pursued, for nearly a year, a theory its own Attorney General said lacked evidentiary support. The lead investigator published a book. The case was shelved. The British investigation spent 13 years and £13.4 million. It produced a briefing to German prosecutors, the nature and content of which has never been fully disclosed publicly, and no independent prosecutorial action. The German prosecution publicly named a prime suspect, then lost the trials they did bring, then watched the suspect walk free. Now, there are institutional defenders who will raise legitimate points here. These are complex cross-jurisdictional investigations. Evidence standards are high. Criminal prosecutions require proof beyond reasonable doubt. International cooperation has genuine legal and operational limits. Public naming of a suspect is not the same as a conclusion of guilt. All of that is true, and none of it fully explains why the apartment wasn't properly sealed in the first 72 hours, why the primary investigative theory for 11 months was built on a conclusion the evidence didn't support, why £13.4 million produced no extradition request, why a man was publicly named as certain to be responsible by a state prosecutor without charges being ready to follow, why, in the year Brückner was due for release, no country moved to detain him on new grounds. Here is what institutional failure actually looks like. It doesn't look like a conspiracy. It rarely does. It looks like a case where the early errors were never fully corrected, where the political pressure to be seen to be doing something substituted for the operational pressure to actually do something, where jurisdictional complexity became a reason to defer rather than a problem to solve, where a 3-year-old girl disappeared, and the machinery built to find her in 3 countries over 19 years produced paperwork. Madeleine McCann would be 22 years old this year. The investigation that was supposed to find her is still open. The man they called their prime suspect is living in a tent. And somewhere in 11,000 pages of Portuguese case files, 13 years of British police work, and 5 years of German prosecutorial effort, there are questions that no institution has yet chosen to answer. Some cases are closed, thus the truth isn't. If you found this investigation useful, subscribe. Every week, Cryptic goes beyond the headlines on cases where the official story doesn't hold up. The next investigation is already in progress.